and that's, why don't we go ahead and call the TABOR ad hoc committee to order on Monday, June 13th at 3:10 p.m. There's really only one item of business on the agenda. And without further ado, I'll introduce Doug McLeod to make staff recommendations.
Thank you, Chair Broom. So the last TABOR ad hoc committee, the co-chairs asked staff to come back with some recommendations, potential recommendations to this body. So what we've done is several of us met in the interim, and we put together a short presentation, just giving some quick background as well as what we think our recommendations would be. We've also reviewed these with General Manager Johnson. She's in support, and she is unable to make this meeting. She may be able to join a little bit late. But without further ado, I will share my screen. All right, hang on just a second, please. I've got to close a few because I don't see it up here. Okay, let me try again here. Okay, hopefully you can see a presentation saying TABOR ad hoc committee staff recommendations.
Yes, I have it on my screen.
But Doug, it's not in presentation mode.
All right, let's see. I'll try this. How does that look?
There we go.
We go. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. All right, as I mentioned, even though it's just my name on here, I should have put everybody's name on here. So there were several of us: Michael Davies, Brendan Morgan, Dee Weiser, Dalton Kelly, Melanie Snyder, and I'm probably leaving a few folks out, but several of us gathered together and talked about what a recommendation is from a legal, financial, and other standpoint, government relations standpoint. So we'll go through just a short history. Just as a reminder, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights background, and we're really just talking about the impact that TABOR revenue limitations are going to have on the base system. And currently, those revenue growth limits would apply beginning in 2025. So the base system debt is paid off in 2024. That would be our base year for measuring what our increases or revenue limitation growth can be in future years. Also, as a reminder, so it would apply, the TABOR revenue growth limitations essentially applies to all revenue with the exception of federal revenues. So it's really all non-federal revenues. And we discussed this in a previous meeting that we need to be aware of that, and considering if we're going to change our tax base or change our tax rates, that would still go into the base and would still be subject to TABOR growth limitations, including things like property taxes. Again, the ratchet down resets the base. So if we go through a recession or we have a decrease in revenue collections in one year, that becomes our new base for the following year. So it ratchets us down, prevents us from participating fully in revenue collections at RTD if the economy recovers or grows at a pace faster than the combination of property values within the district, as well as CPI, the Consumer Price Index inflation. And then again, voter approval is required under TABOR for anything regarding new debt, change in tax rates, as well as to become debruced. Debrucing, of course, is the main form of that is to not be subject to TABOR revenue growth limitations or other TABOR limitations, which is the term debruce. So here are some of the primary options that we have as an organization, knowing that this faces us with TABOR limitations on the base system in 2025. We can do nothing, and we can just manage to that with managing expenditures and utilizing reserves. That could potentially cause us to cut significantly in certain areas if we did have a big downfall in our revenues. The other options that we have would be to try to debruce the base system. That would need voter approval. Use average fare collections, somewhat similar to, and I should say debrucing, essentially that would get us to where we're not subject to TABOR limitations, often over a certain period of time is what that allows us to do. We can also do something similar to what was known as referendum C, which is use average tax collections over a period of more than 1 year as our basis. That way it would smooth it out a bit for that base. It was brought up as a potential item to consider amongst this group, potentially as possibly being maybe more sellable through a ballot measure. And another option might be to diversify our revenue base before those limits apply. That would be a difficult lift. We've looked in the past at what other options we have to raise additional revenues, but we've discussed during this call some other potentials, such as a property tax that we believe RTD has the authority to implement. That would also have to get voter approval, but that could potentially diversify our base going forward, where we wouldn't be subject to swings in the economy that really affect the sales and use tax, which makes up 2/3 of our revenues currently. So I'll pause there. From the staff team, is there anything I've missed so far? Anything you'd like to add? Okay, just a few more slides here.
Yeah, if you do have a question, go ahead and speak up, because I don't have everybody on with their hands. I can't tell if anybody's got their hands up except for 2 or 3 people. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So here's what we would recommend from the staff's perspective. We broke this into 2 pieces because the first area is a relatively small item, but I think it's really quite innovative, and I think it could give us some potential wiggle room outside of just debrucing. It actually buys us some more time. So what Brendan Morgan and some others discussed, including our bond counsel, is the possibility of extending that final maturity bond. So the very last bond that gets paid off, and there's probably a group of them that get paid off in November of 2024, which sets the basis for our debrucing, or for our subject to limitations going forward, and eliminates our debrucing. Expires in 2024. We pay that off. At that point in time, we no longer have any debt, sales and use tax debt, that the voters obligated. Therefore, we are subject to TABOR limitations. So one option that was discussed was that we perhaps refinance one or a handful of those bonds and extend the maturity to 2026. So what that would do is it would keep our debrucing in place. We wouldn't be subject to TABOR limitations until the base year of 2026 as opposed to 2024. The benefit from that is twofold. It would delay the revenue limitations, and it also would give us some additional time, perhaps if we go through a recession, for instance, during the next year or so, which is a lot of discussion about, or if we do decide to go with our main recommendation, which is the second main bullet, to go for a ballot initiative. It does give us a little bit more time to make adjustments, or perhaps go back to the voters for a second bite at a different version if we don't pass in 2024. So the second main bullet there is to seek voter approval to debruce on the base system. And our proposal to this body would be to go for voter approval in the general election on November 5th, 2024.
Doug, this is Bob. What does the first alternative cost, if anything, the district, if you just extend the debt out 2 years?
Sure, great. You know what, Brendan and I had discussion on this. He can explain it a little bit better than me, but Brendan, could you weigh in on that, please?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. We would be, this option would extend, as Doug mentioned, the final maturity from 2024 out into 2026. So we would have an extra 2 years of some interest expense, although we would want to do as little of the bond as possible. We would have some legal fees we would have to do this either through a sales tax bond or a sales tax sort of backed loan through a bank. So there may be some potentially some rating agency fees, but possibly not if we do it through the bank market, if you will. But it would be essentially just legal fees, staff time, and some interest expense for an extra 2 years.
You talking like 25, 30,000 or?
We did not come up with a solid estimate on this yet, but I would expect the cost to be fairly small, yes.
Okay.
Can I chime in there too? What's the time frame where when would we have to have that done or come before the board for approval in order for it to take effect before 2024?
That I might have asked Dalton to chime in here, but certainly we would need to get it done before the final maturity at the end of, I think it's November 1st of 2024. So it'd have to be done before that. If there's any additional TABOR related timing issues, perhaps Dalton, could you chime in here?
I agree with you, Brendan. November 1st, 2024 is the final maturity. So we would need to close prior to that so that the maturity is extended before it's paid off. But under the question, as long as the debt is outstanding, which it would be as long as we close before then, under the question, it would continue to go. So we would just need to close before then. So we have a little time to decide if that's the option that the board wants to go.
Yeah, and yeah, you're suggesting investigating, and I'm sure you'd bring other information to us, but about the only thing I remember from my MBA classes in finance was the instructor saying they ain't no free lunch. And what beyond the out-of-pocket costs, are there pros and cons to refinancing a bond within its last 2 years? Do you otherwise affect the debt? I mean, that's the sort of thing I'd want to have a fuller discussion of when you do investigate it. Thank you.
Brendan, what are your thoughts on that? Yeah, one thing I would say before, Brendan, you start is that we would be talking about just a very small portion of the outstanding debt, right, Brendan? Probably, each bond is generally issued in $5,000 increments for the principal amount. But Brendan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, financially it would be a fairly small cost. There are some things to consider. Those other things to consider that are maybe not so financial, as Director Cook brought up. Things like the timing, as we move through time here, move towards 2024, we will want to be aware of sort of where we are in the economic cycle. If we find ourselves, for conversation's sake, in a recession that impacts sales taxes materially in 2024, and there's a risk of sort of setting that new TABOR base, the annual revenue limit at a lower than we would like level, then we may decide this makes a lot of sense to do in 2024. Let's go ahead. However, if we find ourselves in the other predicament where sales taxes are actually booming in 2024, we may say, well, this would be an okay year to lock the base in here, that revenue limit in at that point in time. So it's a bridge that could be crossed, and probably for the risks involved should be crossed, at some point in the future. As far as the bonds go, no real impact. They're outstanding. They'll be paid off either right now in 2024, and if not, by 2026, if we were to decide to move ahead with this. I think those are the main considerations. The timing is, I think, in my mind, the biggest consideration.
Well, it seems to me like this is something that just be a good idea to pursue this and tee it up so that you can get this done, and you don't have to do it. You can always pull the thing at the last minute if circumstances change. So I'd sure, keep this on the front burner for the time being. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I think it gives another option, and we do have some time to make that decision. We would still recommend going forward, recommend that this ad hoc committee consider going forward with a ballot measure at the general election in 2024 to debruce the base system. That could take many different forms, and we can get into discussions about what that would look like and what the wording would be. There's quite a bit of work that would have to be done in order to prepare for that. The primary reasoning being for that general election as opposed to an off-cycle election was there's better voter turnout, and we believe there would be lower costs to the agency. Oops. So this is what we believe that the high-level steps that would be necessary to undertake this effort going forward. Obviously, we could start looking at the extension of the bond at any point in time and get prepared to pull the trigger, as you say, when the time comes, but we can probably get some of those things in place at any point in time between now and November 2024. However, some of the work for the ballot measure that we believe would need to be accomplished probably beginning in the time frame of January 2023 is to begin polling voters. I'll start working on developing ballot language and then also coordinating with the Secretary of State for the placement on the ballot.
So could I, ask here, if this is going to be a recommendation of our committee, I feel like we've done enough of the work to make a blanket recommendation. Could we perhaps talk about tentatively seeking to go to the voters? Because we haven't polled, I think we'd have to have some sense that we'd be successful. I wouldn't want to just try it for the heck of it. We wouldn't do that. That's not what you guys do. So rather than just say a recommendation is to go to the voters in 2024, couch it in terms that make it sound like, if we go to the voters soon, that would be the first time we'd see, or, depending upon polling and developments at the time, et cetera. Just wanted to qualify that recommendation a little bit.
Yeah, we might want to use the word explore.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Yes. Good. Thank you.
Doug,
That is-
this is Dee Weiser. I don't know if you knew I was on. I'm also doubling up as Dalton Kelly here, but I just, one observation there is you may have a legislative piece to this that you would want to pursue in the next legislative session. And that is because, as was noted in the slide, under the current Secretary of State's rules, this ballot question would be last on the ballot among TABOR ballot issues. A few years ago, the legislature adopted a bill saying that if RTD had a sales tax election, such a sales tax increase election would come right after state measures. So you could go back to the legislature and get a similar bill passed to deal with debrucing questions, or I suppose go to the Secretary of State and look for her to change her rules. But that's a piece you might want to deal with in the short term.
So Dee, you're suggesting that perhaps we add that as part of our recommended action, exploring that possibility with the legislator.
Unless you're willing to be last on the ballot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
What's the pros and cons of being last on the ballot? Obviously, fewer people are going to vote on the measure, but
well, I think Bob, particularly if you go in a 2024 election cycle, there's very likely to be other statewide measures. We already know of several of our school district clients in the metro area are thinking about 2024 ballot issues. Because it is a presidential election year, we tend to see more tax and debt measures on ballots in those years for the reasons that Doug noted, that it's a higher turnout election. So you could be well down the list of TABOR measures.
and people will have felt like they've already spent all their money.
Could well be, yeah.
Yeah,
They're already accustomed to check marking no by that point. So,
Or at least ballot fatigue may have set in.
yeah.
well, I think that's a good suggestion. And, Bob, do you think we could add that as potential recommendation to the board, and or to our good staff and lobbyists and so forth to explore that possibility.
Yeah, I think, the board needs to have its opportunity to weigh in and discuss this rather than it being presented kind of as a fait accompli. Because I think it is a major thing to decide to put something like this on the ballot. You're putting your reputation on the line basically, and maybe you've got a number of people on the board that like TABOR. So we don't really have a handle on that at this point in time. And the only way to flesh that stuff out is to have a discussion.
So we were talking earlier about the meeting schedule, and it might be that we could bring this to the board in a study session type format, an update, Bob, before our committee finalizes its recommendations. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes.
Okay. I like that.
Now, I notice on the actions necessary. So why don't we get back onto the agenda and work through the final stuff that's being presented to us here. Doug?
Oh, thank you, Director Grimm. Yeah, that was actually the end of the slides, and I can sure go back to those if you'd like.
Well, for example, pool voters, that means you're going to have to hire somebody to do this, or are we going to attempt to do this in-house? And I heard Doug say he was going to take a crack at developing ballot language.
We do have some examples of ballot language that Dee Weiser had supplied, and I'll let you comment on this, Dee. And I do believe, at least as far as the polling goes, we would need to engage with a firm that could do that polling for us. We don't have the capabilities or expertise in-house. Dee,
Yeah,
please.
in my experience, we oftentimes see clients hire a political pollster to poll most likely voters in the election. And most often the pollster will want to draft a ballot language in advance to put in the poll in the field so that then the questions can circle around the language. And there may be an option of sunset or not, that sort of thing. But I think it would help you be informed about whether it's even worth the effort of having a debrucing election if you don't have enough support in the poll.
Okay. Then I guess that's one item that we need to put on our next agenda, is to discuss the timing of these various actions and develop a timetable or proposed timetable